Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another wonderful VAC Roundtable. And this one is another historical one and somebody who we all hold in high regard. He's one of the original architects of the drug war that we all know. And he's one of the few people that I have seen that has worked tirelessly behind the scenes to actually make change happen in this resolve. And so, with that in mind, we're really, really honored to host Eric Sterling, Eric E. Sterling, as he is known. And he has been somebody I've looked up to since I was a neophyte activist back in 93 when I first cut my teeth and with Cannabis Action Network. And he would go on to mentor that kind of organization, that's a CEDAS, SSDP, amongst others. And yeah, we just want to first off welcome Eric Sterling, and we're going to forego the how did you come to cannabis question because this is too important a discussion to get into. So I'm just going to jump right into it with our first question. So, first of all, thank you. And jumping right off the diving board, knowing that you once worked in the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on the Judiciary, on the staff of the Subcommittee on Crime, you went on to become one of the country's leading critics of the war on drugs. What experiences caused that evolution in your thinking?
Hey, Jen, thank you so much, and thank everybody at Veterans Action Council. I'm really honored to be asked to be part of this roundtable, and um, I commend you on all of your good work uh, at the United Nations, in Vienna, and in New York, and your all of the behind the scenes work that you have done, as well as the stuff that you do front and center. Um, and I appreciate, the very thoughtful questions that you've prepared. So in 1979, when I started working for the Judiciary Committee, there were bills to decriminalize marijuana that were uh, pending before the committee. Um, in 1979, Jimmy Carter was still the president. Jimmy Carter had campaigned on a marijuana decriminalization platform. He had advocated it early in his administration in 1977. Um, so that it was not radical thinking by any stretch to think about drug policy reform as common sense, as logical. Um, through the through the process of members of Congress uh, retiring and new members taking on subcommittee responsibilities, I was traded sort of like a baseball player to a new subcommittee, the Subcommittee on Crime. And I had the drugs jurisdiction. I had already organized a hearing on DEA oversight in 1980. And I was a skeptic about the war on drugs from the very beginning. Um, I, I was certainly a lot more sympathetic to uh, decriminalizing or legalizing cannabis. I don't think I did not know as much about other drugs, but what experiences were key was first the character of congressional rhetoric around the drug issue that to it's one thing that you sort of, okay, I'm going to write, my chairman has said, write an opening statement for a hearing on some part of the drug problem. You have to write a statement. Well, then you begin to hear language about plagues and scourges and epidemics, and you would You would hear a member say, "We have lost a generation to drugs." And I'd look around the room and I'd look at all the congressional staffers and I'd say, well, you know, these are all men and women who, not so long ago, if not last night, used one or another illegal drug. This is not a generation that has been lost to drugs. There are individuals who've been lost to it, but this is the generation that created rock and roll, that created the internet, that is staffing the Congress. This is not a generation lost to drugs. And you begin to appreciate the complete diverse from reality between um, what is being said and what you know to be true. So that that begins to sort of then shape you. A second kind of thing then is, okay, my job is to write laws. Where did these laws come from? What's the history of these laws? Um, so a very important book, so I started studying. So a very important book was The American Disease by David Musto, who, in the early 1970s, writes a study that sort of points to the racism that underlies the laws regarding the Harrison Narcotics Act, the control of cocaine and heroin, opioids. You then not too long begin to sort of find out what's going on with how did the marijuana laws come about? What were the claims that Harry Anslinger, the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, was making? And so at one level, I'm beginning to see that there is no intellectual integrity to what's being said, that the laws themselves are not grounded in any kind of scientific record at the time that they're enacted. They're grounded in racism and political opportunity, and that begins to sound very much like what we were experiencing in 1980. And the and then then in the summer of 1983, I accompanied members of Congress on a international fact-finding mission to Latin America. We went to Mexico, Peru, Bolivia, Colombia, and Jamaica. And the members of the Congress are there to sort of learn from the ambassador and from the DEA representatives what's going on in these countries, and then to meet with the leaders of these countries to stress the importance of drug control by the United States and to see what they're doing. In Peru, the chairman and ranking member, I and some others flew up to a part of Peru, the Alta Huallaga Valley, where a place called Tingo Maria. We flew into a grass airstrip, and were greeted by the UMAPAR, the Specialized Anti-Narcotics Police, and we're given a tour of coca cultivation and coca processing in the jungle. The sort of just a whole dog and pony show, of how coca is converted into into coca paste. And then we see U.S. taxpayer funded eradication taking place. Now, we knew that to eradicate coca, um, you, if you're going to chop it down, you had to apply the pesticide right to the root stalk of what you've cut down. What we saw were extremely old bushes. We had seen only an hour earlier productive bushes that were being harvested and the leaves were being dried. Now we're looking at bushes that are like covered in moss, and they're scraggly. They're being cut down, and the pesticide is being sprayed on the ground around them. They are applying herbicide because they're pruning the bushes to begin them to be ready for further growth. And the congressman who represented Cape May, New Jersey, who lived on the beach, who know the ocean, who's on the Merchant Marine Committee, says to me, "Now I know the meaning of the term pissing into the wind." To see, here's the audacity to sort of show visiting members of Congress what you're claiming is an eradication effort, but you're actually cultivating the coca with the U.S. taxpayers' dollars. And of course, in this flight, we had seen, countless fields of green, as we're flying, over Peru. Later in the trip, we saw the same kind of thing with cannabis cultivation in eastern Colombia. So the futility of it, the intellectual dishonesty of it, probably the most valuable thing I read was the book by Thomas Saz called Ceremonial Chemistry. And this book, I urge everybody in the Veterans Action Council to read. It advanced my thinking about drugs by a light year because it put into a much more profound kind of philosophical frame how bad prohibition is and where it's coming from and the the way in which it is so contrary to American values of individual liberty. So these were things that it was not sort of. I mean, these were the things that sort of shaped my thinking, so that um, I became a very ardent legalizer. We had a bill introduced to make the robbery of pharmacies or the burglary of pharmacies a federal crime. There were instances where um, people with opioid addictions would go to the pharmacy and stick it up. Their dealer, their connection had been busted. They couldn't get something. They knew that they would get um, pure, unadulterated, in certain dosage forms, narcotics that would ward off their dope sickness. So who are these people? They're local people going to the local pharmacy. They come in, maybe they're wearing a mask, maybe they're not. Give me the drugs. They jump out and they drive out their car, south on Main Street. And the pharmacist then picks up the phone and he doesn't call the DEA field office in the state capitol and say, three guys just robbed me and they're, going south on Main Street in a Chevrolet. No, you call 911, you call the local police. And the local police are eager to investigate robberies and burglaries. And the local prosecutor is eager to prosecute those cases and send the offenders, if guilty, to prison. There's simply no need for this. And what I learned, and this is in some way kind of a paradigm of sort of how Washington works. In this period, in the 1980s, the large retail drug chains, CVS, Rite Aid, Walgreens, were dramatically expanding, and they were driving out of business the mom and pop local retail pharmacy that's at the corner of Main Street and Market Street. And that little pharmacy had belonged for many years to something called the National Association of Retail Druggists, NARD. So the NARD is losing membership, and their members are struggling, saying, "Gee, I mean, I'm struggling to stay in business. Do I want to send annual dues to belong to this association in Washington? What the hell are they doing for me anyway?" And the executive director comes up with this idea. Let's make the robbery of pharmacies a federal crime. Let's show my members we're doing something. And he found Congressman Henry Hyde from Illinois, who was happy to be their champion. Hyde was a prominent Republican in the House of Representatives on the Judiciary Committee, and he was happy to have his photograph on the cover of the magazine. He was delighted to go to their annual meeting and accept a plaque as the legislator of the year, for introducing this legislation. He was happy to be the champion against the robbery of pharmacies. My boss was a former state prosecutor in New Jersey, and he understood this proposed law is absurd. It will have nobody's going to use it. Nobody needs it. But he in his other legislative matters wanted a favor from Congressman Hyde. So he agrees then to move Hyde's bill. And we have a hearing. And so now the pharmacy press is calling me So, Mr. Sterling, what's happening with Hyde's pharmacy robbery bill? Where's it stand? What's its status? What can you tell us? Well, we had a strict rule. Staff could not speak on the record. I had to be very, very careful. Always, no conversation began explaining this is off the record. This is not for attribution. You can't use anything that I say in any way. Okay. This is strictly for background. So I'd explain what the status of the bill is. Then I'd explain why the bill was stupid. Then I would say, look, if we're really interested in preventing these robberies and these burglaries, legalize heroin. Then you don't have people needing to go to a pharmacy. If they are able to get a known dosage of unadulterated heroin from a legal outlet, you're not going to have pharmacy robbery as a problem. And of course, the kind of reporters on the other end of the call, kind of silent for a minute or two, or a moment or two. Yeah, and it ranges from, well, that makes sense, or that's interesting. I was lucky. I was never burned by a reporter. No reporter ever said, gee, here's a story. Counsel of the House Judiciary Committee is urging the legalization of drugs to reporters when they call them up on the phone. There's a story. Well, that fortunately never happened. But it was a measure of the kinds of risks I was going to take because I was so convinced that the drug policy was counterproductive. So these are the kinds of experiences, that led to my activism, even before I left Capitol Hill.
Wow, that is quite a journey, but one worth understanding because it's only somebody who's absolutely immersed in it could see through in your case, right? So, Council Member Landau, you're up next with our next question.
Eric, thank you so much for your decades-long work. You're the giant where you stand on your shoulders. So thank you so much. My
Thank you.
question is, sorry.
I just said thank you.
Thank you. We are very interested in your experience working under then Senator Joe Biden during your time working for the Judiciary Committee. As Joe helped create these drug wars stats, it seems like he might have experienced a metamorphosis decades later by asking for cannabis to be rescheduled. What can you tell us about his history with drug policy that might help us understand this better? Thank you.
So, of course, I worked for the House Judiciary Committee, and Senator Biden was in the Senate and on the Senate Judiciary Committee. And in 1981, well, the election of 1980, in which Jimmy Carter was defeated by Ronald Reagan, was a political earthquake in Washington. The Congress had been controlled, House and Senate, by the Democrats since the mid-1950s. And here in the 1980 election, control of the Senate switched to the Republican Party. This is for the first time in a quarter century. The Republicans now control the Senate, and the Democrats do not. The top senator on the Judiciary Committee was Teddy Kennedy. Kennedy had, in fact, I had my work when I was hired in 1979 was in part because Kennedy was in 1979 the new chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee. He was from Boston, and a new subcommittee chairman from Boston was a Jesuit priest named Robert Drinan, who had been the dean at the Boston College School of Law. Drinan had been elected to Congress in 1970 as a strong anti-war member. And he was the first member of the Congress to introduce resolutions of impeachment against Richard Nixon in 1972. Drinan finally had enough seniority in 1979 to move up to this subcommittee called the Subcommittee on Criminal Justice, which had one big responsibility, which was to handle the entire rewrite of the Federal Criminal Code. The Federal Criminal Code was last reorganized in about 1948, and it's organized alphabetically. It's not organized thematically, so that so that the different kinds of property crimes, the different kinds of crimes against people, they're not together. They don't have common descriptions of conduct. They don't have common descriptions of the states of mind. They don't have common descriptions of the circumstances. Each one sort of dates from whenever in the history of the Congress this particular law got passed. And so they're inconsistent, to say the least. And so this was also, of course, true in many of the state legislatures. And in the mid-1950s, an effort to simplify and organize and to codify criminal law developed under the leadership of the American Law Institute. And they proposed a model penal code, which many states adopted in the 60s and 70s. When I was a public defender in Pennsylvania, I was using the relatively new model penal code that had been enacted in Pennsylvania. So in 1968, Congress passed a law to create a commission to study the Federal Criminal Code and to see whether or not it ought to be rewritten in a modern sort of penal code form. Should it be, reorganized in a modern thematic way? And a commission was created. The commission comes up and says, yes, we should do this. This makes perfect sense. Well, the commission comes back, but there's now President Richard M. Nixon and Attorney General John Mitchell. And their interest in rewriting the criminal code was a little bit different. They saw this as an opportunity to write the criminal code in a way to expand federal prosecutorial power, to define offenses in ways that might be more harmful to labor unions, to war protesters, to civil libertarians, in a variety of ways. And so that is the version that they introduce. Now, this is a bit in the weeds, but the Senate, it's very important to understand that culturally, the Senate Judiciary Committee has long been aligned with the Department of Justice. The Senate Judiciary Committee has the responsibility to advise and consent in the appointment of the officers of the Department of Justice. They confirm the Attorney General and all the Assistant Attorney Generals and all of the United States Attorney prosecutors around the country. There's 96 some prosecutors. All are confirmed by the Senate, and they all go through the Senate Judiciary Committee first. So that the people who've been confirmed or holding office in the Justice Department often owe their jobs more to a senator than to the Attorney General, and certainly more to a senator than perhaps the president. And by the same token, then, the Senate staff, many of them are interested in being appointed to United States Attorney as a stepping stone in their own political career back home. So that there is a much closer, less adversarial relationship. The House of Representatives historically has been much more hostile to the Department of Justice. They didn't have any of those cozy relationships. And at that time, it was led by Emanuel Seller, a liberal from Brooklyn, New York. And so when the criminal code comes forward, the Senate Judiciary Committee starts looking at it favorably, and it passes the Senate, and it dies in the House. Passes in the Senate, dies in the House. Passes in the Senate, dies in the House. So that this was not a particularly important subcommittee, because the job of the subcommittee was simply to kill the legislation, not to pass it. And there was sort of the staffer, who was involved in killing it. Suddenly, when Drinan comes in from Massachusetts, and Kennedy is now the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, the two Boston liberal lawyers say, we can write a civil liberties respecting criminal code. Why don't we do it? And so suddenly the chief counsel for the subcommittee is now on the opposite side. His boss wants to pass this legislation. The reason I was hired in November 1979 to work for the House Judiciary Committee was because I was the most plausible, unqualified man they could find. When I was hired in November, now, those of you who follow legislation at all know the US Congress works on a 2-year calendar. There's the odd year and then the even year, which is the election year. And so if you want to bring a big bill to the floor, you've got to start moving fast to get it ready to take to the floor. The chief counsel knew if I can convince Drinan that he needs highly specialized counsel to sort of take this on, and he needs his people to come on, he could drag out even the hiring process. So I'm not hired in March or April of the odd number year when the work should be getting going at warp speed. I'm hired in November. Now, had I a long record as working as a federal defender? No. Had I been an assistant United States attorney trying cases, knowing what the federal law is and knowing what the rulings of the different circuit courts? No. Had I ever clerked for a federal judge? No. I was told that they had interviewed 20 people before they interviewed me. I'd never practiced in federal court. I'd never been in federal court except when I was arrested and for protesting the Vietnam War inside the Pentagon. That was my entire experience in federal court. But with my civil liberties ACLU background, I was the most plausible but completely unqualified attorney the chief counsel could foist upon Father Drinan for this job. Well, the legislation did not get to the floor. The chief counsel plot succeeded in delaying this. So in the election of 80, when Reagan takes over and the Republicans take the Senate, Teddy Kennedy gives up the Senate Judiciary Committee to become the top Democrat on the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, to be the lead Democrat on those issues, which he thought he could play a better role. And Joe Biden, a more junior senator, becomes the top Democrat when Strom Thurmond from South Carolina, a Republican who had run for president in 1948 on a Dixiecrat platform. Strom Thurmond broke from the Democratic Party in 1948, running on a platform that lynching should not be made a federal crime. It was a state matter. That was a central part of Strom Thurmond's 1948 presidential campaign. Strom Thurmond had been governor and then got elected as a senator. Originally as a Democrat and then switched and he was Republican, and now he becomes the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee. And Joe Biden is his young sidekick. And Joe is very eager to work with Strom Thurmond. Joe would frequently say, everything I know, I learned from Strom Thurmond. Joe he was I think he was the youngest senator in his class. He was very, very young when he was elected. He'd been a public defender for a little while before, and maybe he'd been a county official in Newcastle County, Delaware. And he had just luckily defeated an incumbent Republican in his campaign when he was first elected. So Joe becomes the top Democrat. And the issue of drugs was being driven by rhetoric from the White House and from the administration. There was the growing problem perceived of cocaine. I mean, the Reagan era was an ideal era for cocaine. Limousines, status, Hollywood society. We're number one. What drug makes you feel you're number one? Like cocaine. It was the drug that perfectly fit the Reagan administration cultural zeitgeist. When they came into power. And so you have a very significant increase in trafficking cocaine, use of cocaine, and rhetoric around cocaine, and violence in the cocaine market, as there is battles for control in which the Colombians are battling to displace the Colombians' historical role controlling the South Florida drug trade. And so this violence and this use of, machine guns, for example, or other automatic weapons, this idea then we need to have a war on drugs. And the rhetoric, though, is from both parties. The Democrats are fully on, because Ronald Reagan campaigned as a cut taxes, cut federal waste, cut federal spending kind of guy. And so in the spring of 1981, when the OMB director, David Stockman, issues, here are the cuts. We're going to cut all these different federal agencies. I'm alerting Congress. He cut a few $100,000 out of the DEA budget in the spring of 1981. And so the Democrats jump on this like a cat on catnip. Reagan wants to cut the DEA, and look at this crisis of cocaine. And so, it was the sums, a few $100,000. We're talking about, peanuts, truly, in federal spending. At that time, the DA budget was $170 million. It was just a small amount of money. But Democrats saw this opportunity to begin to score political points. They wanted to be tougher than Republicans on drugs. And so Joe Biden is reading the room. The public is against drugs. They're afraid of drugs. They're afraid of drug violence. He's not thinking about this as a historian. He's not thinking about it. He's thinking about it as a politician. And he's got to work with Strom Thurmond. And so one of the first bills that I worked on in the Congress that ended in 1982, my portion of the bill was to authorize spending on urinalysis for federal probationers and parolees, what we've jokingly called the pee in the bottle bill. And that bill had passed the House. And at the end of 1982 became the vehicle that was amended with a bill dealing with aircraft hijacking, the contamination of drugs like the poisoning of Tylenol. And there were a bunch of, there were some other provisions. And one of the provisions added at the last minute was one that Biden had been pushing, and that the Democrats were pushing, was to get a drug czar into Ronald Reagan's cabinet. We had been saying, who's in, Ronald Reagan, the nice, Uncle Ronald Reagan, you're not a drug czar. You're not, don't tell us you're in charge of the war on drugs. Who's coordinating this effort? And so Biden introduces a bill to create a drug czar. And Strom Thurmond agrees and goes along with this. And so the package that starts with this pee in the bottle bill that I had developed, package passes the House, passes the Senate, goes to the president, and the attorney general says, "What? A drug czar? I'm the chief law enforcement officer. This is terrible. You can't, undermine my power as attorney general." And Reagan then allows the bill to be vetoed by what is known as a pocket veto. And the bill dies. And all of the other work dealing with aircraft hijacking and poisoning Tylenol and so forth, that all dies as well. And so Biden was somewhat chastened by this. This little initiative that he had ended up resulting in the death of this drug legislation. The drug issue continued to evolve in the early 80s. The administration said, well, gee, you know what? We got this pressure for a drug czar. Let's name the vice president the drug czar. So George H.W. Bush is named the head of the South Florida Task Force. And he's going to be involved in overseeing, the war on cocaine. And we're going to give increased power to the military to get involved in drug enforcement. And this is kind of going back and forth. And the Republicans and the Democrats are battling who is tougher on crime, who is tougher on drugs. In early 83, the Reagan administration sent to the Congress something they called the Comprehensive Crime Control Act. It had more than 50 major provisions. It was going to amend the criminal code in a whole bunch of ways and the drug laws. And since there had been recently this defeat of a comprehensive package, the leadership of the House and Senate Judiciary Committee said, we'll move this package, we'll break it up, and we'll move it into separate bills. And so some were assigned to, in the House, into like 4 different subcommittees. And we're having hearings, we moved some of it, we moved a child pornography bill as at the White House when that got signed. There were other pieces of this legislation moving. Well, in 84, as the 84 election is approaching, the Senate just decides, we're just going to pass this whole bloody bill, unamended. We're just going to pass it and send it to the House. So the bill passes the Senate. In September of 84, as an effort to pass appropriations every fall, how do we refund the federal government for the next fiscal year? The fiscal year ends on September 30th. If Congress doesn't pass a bill, the federal government is out of money. This is a story we all have heard over and over again. Well, this was going on back in the 80s. And so the typical thing that the Republicans would do is when the funding bill came up, the Republicans had a parliamentary tool called the motion to recommit with instructions, where they would offer an amendment, and the amendment would be considered in the House of Representatives as though it had gone to committee and come back, and that the bill had been in some sense rewritten according to the way this new language was. And typically it was, in a funding bill, strike out every dollar amount and reduce it by 3%, because that's the amount of waste, fraud, and abuse we think is in the legislation. So in September of 84, big elections coming up. Walter Mondale is running against Ronald Reagan for president. House and Senate races are up. And the Republicans bring forward Dan Lundgren from California. And he offers, on behalf of the motion to recommit, all of the Senate passed crime bill, subject to 10 minutes of debate, 5 minutes in favor, 5 minutes against, 50 major provisions to change the criminal code, included sentencing reform, bail reform, created the Sentencing Commission. It had a host of provisions that were very, very important to federal law. It passes the House by 60 votes. It's 6 weeks before the election. And there were enough Democrats saying, I'm not going to vote against the president's crime bill 6 weeks before the election. Am I stupid? So the Democrats lost big in 1984. And so the Democrats are now looking toward 86. And Biden is looking toward 86 because the senators who took control of the Senate on the Reagan landslide of 80, on the Reagan coattails of 80, they're now up for re-election in 86, but there's no Ronald Reagan at the top of the ticket. And so Tip O'Neill, the Speaker of the House, he recognizes that if the Democrats play the drug issue correctly, they could grab it from the Republicans and they could defeat Reagan's first term guys, and the Democrats could retake control of the Senate, and the natural order would be returned to Washington, D.C. Well, Biden is part of all of this. This is all about the politics. And so the Democratic bill that I played a central role in writing, called the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, which included mandatory minimums, it didn't matter how wacky the idea was. If somebody was a Democrat and they were behind it, they got to have it, because there was something from every committee: Merchant Marine and Fisheries, Education and Labor, the Agriculture Committee. Of course, you've got to deal with marijuana growing in the National Forest. Ways and Means Committee, they got the Customs Service. education and labor, we're going to have drug-free schools, foreign affairs, we're going to sort of identify foreign countries that aren't cooperating with us. So this Biden is a part of this whole effort. Now, how sincere is he? How much is he truly convinced? Well, we do know, that his son Hunter has had a long substance abuse problem. How does that play into a member's views about the dangers of drugs when he sees this with his own family? How does it, the other piece of it is very hard for members of Congress to give up talking points that they've memorized. It's hard for them to change positions. It's hard for all of us to change our positions. And so, you know, whether or not Biden began as a drug warrior, the role worked for him. He saw the advantage of being a friend of the cops. He saw the political advantages for him as a Democrat, as the Democratic leader on crime and drugs and criminal justice, to be tough, so that the Democratic brand was associated with his toughness. So I don't know, whether or not, how sincere he was. The other piece of it certainly is that by the time he's now saying we need to have a study of cannabis for purposes of rescheduling, when he's the president of the United States, after 2021, well, again, as a politician, look around. We've had, legal marijuana passing overwhelmingly in Colorado and Oregon back in 2012. We're talking about, that was, 8, 9 years ago. We see additional states, marijuana is being legalized, but the polling has changed. This is no longer, when they say this is no longer your grandfather's marijuana, it's no longer your grandfather's marijuana users. The whole climate around cannabis had changed. And so, the political momentum was the federal government is a problem here. Schedule 1 is completely inconsistent with what we're seeing happening in so many of the states. Moving to Schedule 3 is, from the perspective of DEA, actually a good thing, because it gets DEA back into the marijuana control business. Right now, DEA is out of the marijuana control business. With the Hinchy-Rohrbacher, amendments, you've got appropriations law that says that the DEA cannot interfere in, state legal medical cannabis and state legal recreational programs if they're complying with the state law. They're out. Doesn't matter that it's Schedule 1. Bring it in as Schedule 3. This completely reinvigorates DEA's rulemaking capacity, its registration capacity. DEA now has the authority to say, everybody who's a dispensary under state law around the country, they have to answer to us. They need to be inspected by us. They need to keep records that satisfy us. They need to have, they need a license that we decide whether or not they're qualified to have. And so I think that Schedule 3, aside from its symbolic value as an acknowledgement by the federal government that cannabis has medical use, and that is an extremely important symbolic achievement, I think that it has tremendous potential to destroy the legal cannabis industry and limit access as we understand it. So does Biden understand that when he says, let's go with Schedule 3? I don't know. Was it inconsistent? I mean, bottom line, going to Schedule 3 brings the feds back into the regulation and control of all of the state legal cannabis industry. And if you're a power-seeking bureaucrat, this is good news.
Thank you for that in-depth assessment, as well as the historical perspective of those who actually pull the trigger and why are very much things that matter. So thank you for sharing with that. Michael Krause has a follow-up. Michael.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks, Eric, for that. That's a really fascinating uh, narrative, history of where we came from. It leaves me with more questions than I started with, which is probably good. That shows you're on the right track. Probably when you dig into the whole, you find you got more questions. But I don't know. It just seems very interesting. I mean, on one side of the coin. It's just possible that then Senator and then President Biden just read the room. He's a really good politician. He took the expedient political route with very little, sort of big think associated with it, and got us to where we are. And then it's also possible that he's working on like fourth level chess and really opposing us in a way that's masterful. I think yeah, I think I think the first sort of alternative strikes me. There has to be a certain amount of truth to that, no matter which is the real answer. Because from what you said, that he did seem to be that politician that read the room and acted, in the political expediency. I mean, I just wonder, these guys, did they realize the repercussions of what they were doing? Was that something that they just saw as a collateral damage that was necessary for their political gain? I don't know. I've witnessed a lot of big equation stuff, like when we talked to Hillary Clinton when she took over at the State Department, and talked about the administration under, I guess it was Obama, doing a bunch of cannabis stuff. And she very frankly told the movement, hey, we've got this whole stack of things we're trying to do. If we can get through those, we're doing great. I don't think cannabis is on the list right now. She was just literally open like that. I can sort of handle that, but I'm not sure I can handle that, I just don't care. That this, would have negative repercussions, and I just don't care because we have to do this or we have to do that.
No,
I don't know.
so
There's a fine line between the two, I guess.
so Mike, I don't think that Biden at all said this is a way that I can kill a legal cannabis industry and limit access. No, I don't think that at all. I think that there may have been people writing papers who unstated were aware of this. I mean, one has to, I mean, DEA is in some sense being consulted. ONDCP is being consulted. Other people at the Department of Justice in the Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs section are being consulted. There are career law enforcement people who are, being consulted. I think that Biden was in good faith. I think that Biden in general is a man of good faith. I don't think that Biden, there was nothing that ever made me think that Biden was malicious or terribly sneaky. He's a much more of an open book kind of a guy, I believe. And I mean, I had well, I guess the privilege. He and I debated one on one in October 1990 at Georgetown Law School the question of legalizing drugs. The Student Bar Association, the issue was hot at that point. Ethan Nadelman had written his articles. There had been hearings of the House Narcotics Committee in 1988 about legalizing drugs. And Biden was now, the Democrats had taken the Senate in 87. So he's the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee. And the Student Bar Association invited him to debate legalization of drugs, and they invited me to be the pro-legalizer. So it was just Biden and me on the platform for like an hour and a half. And, I mean, he was relatively thoughtful. He was not, I mean, after he read sort of the talking points and what his staff had written for him, then he started, listening and sort of thinking, I think, much more. So, I mean, it's hard to know. I mean, unless you really work closely with a member over a period of time to know them, to know, how they really think, how they really operate, what they really believe. I worked for Bill Hughes from New Jersey for 8 years. He was the chairman of the crime subcommittee. He was a former prosecutor. Bill Hughes was honest. He was not the kind of member who would say a line of bullshit and then believe his own bullshit. He was, he understood the limits of what he knew. He was very hardworking. He was very intelligent. I would prepare materials for Bill Hughes. He'd get them on Wednesday night and open up the hearing on Thursday morning, and he would ask questions that were even more penetrating than I had written for him to ask. He was a very good, he'd been a very, very successful trial lawyer. He was very smart. So he's smart, he's hardworking, he's honest, and he was a gentleman. And I love work. He was much more conservative than I was generally. But I went to him in the spring of '85. We had, I'd mentioned this Comprehensive Crime Control Act of '84. Our subcommittee had processed large parts of it. We'd processed gun legislation, pornography legislation, money laundering legislation. We'd done a whole lot of stuff. And Bill Hughes was known as the guy, he's the crime subcommittee chairman in the House, and he's an effective get stuff done chairman. And I went to him, I said, you have the credibility to support the legalization of marijuana. I put this in a memo to him in writing. And, the way I often would communicate to him. And as often was the case, maybe it would be like 6 o'clock, he'd call me up to his office, as he's sort of, finally catching up on, with staff and administration. He says, and essentially said, Eric, I got your memo. I think there are only two ways I can be defeated. And one of them is if I advocate for the legalization of marijuana. Well, you're not going to argue with that. I mean, he knows his district. He represented South Jersey. He represented the most conservative part of the state of New Jersey. It's so. But he doesn't throw me out of the office. He doesn't say, I want your resignation, tomorrow morning. I continued to work for him for 4 more years. But he knew where I was coming from, and respected the work that I did for him. So Joe Biden, I didn't work with him that closely. It was much more remote. I share one anecdote about Joe Biden. It's in 1984. It's in September of '84. In fact, in the connection of this crime bill. So the crime bill has passed the House and the Senate as an amendment to an appropriations bill. And the conference is then between the House and Senate Appropriations Committee on dealing with this amendment. It's like a 470-page amendment. It's huge. And a meeting is held in Strom Thurmond's office off the Senate floor. Kennedy is there. But the meeting is being run by Warren Rudman, who was the senator from New Hampshire, who was the chair of the Senate Appropriations Subcommittee for these matters, and co-chaired by Congressman Neil Smith from Iowa. And the way the Appropriations Committee is all about dollars and cents and cutting, let's make a deal. What's the middle? How do we compromise? So they've got a list of like 20 big political issues in the crime legislation, kind of treating it like a financial negotiation. What's the price going to be? Where can the two sides, the buyers and the sellers, agree to make a deal? It's all about making a deal. So it's, I don't know, maybe it's 10 o'clock at night, when this meeting is taking place. So Rodino is there from New Jersey, the chairman of our committee. Bill Hughes is in there, my boss. I'm there with my chief counsel. And, we're like writing notes frantically to give to the chairman to sort of, here's some talking points on this particular matter. And so at one point, so Joe Biden famously takes the Amtrak train home every night to be with his family. So it's 10 o'clock at night. Joe Biden has already left Capitol Hill. He's back home in Wilmington on the telephone. So there's a telephone on a table on the other end of the room. And somebody's holding a phone saying, who wants to talk to Joe? Does anybody want to talk to Joe? Nobody's rushing over to grab the phone. Who wants to talk to Joe? But because he can only access this thing by a landline telephone, in September 1984.
And what a time, what a place, and what a mark to leave. But change came eventually. All right, Mary Lynn Mathry has our next question. Councilmember Mathry, you're up. You're gonna have
And
to
you're
unmute.
muted.
You have to unmute. Wait, I'm terrible at reading lips.
Sorry about that. Hey, Eric. Was there much discussion inside the Judiciary Committee about the drug control treaty while the worst of the drug war policies were being drafted and considered? And what did that discussion look like? And what was its impact on the emerging policy?
It's a very good question. It's a very sophisticated question. I can't recall that the treaties were discussed at all. I don't recall that, I don't, certainly they were not matters in which sort of we needed to bring in an expert witness to talk about what the treaties did or did not require or allow. It simply, in my 8 years, it was not a consideration. I did think about them. In As I gotten sort of involved more in the reform side of things, I met a professor at American University named Arnold Trebeck. Arnold had written a book called The Heroin Solution, talking of, favorably comparing the sort of legal regulated heroin market in Britain to the out of control problems in the United States. And Arnold taught at American University in the School of Justice. And I had gotten to know him, and he said, we've got a course in international narcotics policy coming up. I don't have anybody to teach it. Would you teach this course? And I thought, hell yeah. This will be an opportunity for me to sort of kind of go much more in depth into these treaties. What's the history of these treaties? What are these relationships? What are the UN organs and so on? So if there had been something going on, if there had been conversations about this, at least after that time, I would have been pretty sensitive to it. And I can't recall. I mean, the only time that it essentially would come up is that essentially DEA might assert that they had to do it this way because it was required by one of the conventions. And then, of course, there was, the 88 Vienna Convention was being discussed sort of in this time period as well. So you had the 61, you had the 70, and then you had, this later one, as the war on drugs is growing. But
Yeah,
was there discussion on the Senate side? Were these issues that were being raised? Not that I'm aware of, but I was pretty busy on my own side of the house, on the side of the Capitol.
right on.
Yeah.
No, it's yeah, people forget that even though everything is close together, how far apart they necessarily are at times. All right, Michael Krawitz has our next question.
Thanks, Etienne. So I'll read the question in a second, but I wanted to just broach this subject a little bit wider than the question goes. Our assessment of the moment that we're in right now is that we could be doing a lot better if it were only for good faith actions of the entities involved. And we'll give credit where credit's due. The DEA has acted better and in good faith, we think, in the way it's operated, but we don't think that the FDA has. And the reason why we don't think so is because there are certain things that the FDA could have done, probably should have done already, that could have helped integrate cannabis into a Schedule III framework in a way that would help, for example, us veterans be able to access cannabis in various places around the country. The thing that we were looking at as a model was the compound pharmacist. But a compound pharmacist can't handle cannabis because they haven't put it on a list that is appropriate for compound pharmacists to be able to access it. It's that simple. It was an overt action to deny cannabis access to this framework. And, on another level, in another book, if you will, the federal government, I don't even know where exactly in the federal government lies the blame for this, but adult recreational cannabis has never been implemented properly. The recreational cannabis, as we see it, can be operated at the federal level under an exemption to the drug control treaty. And that's something that there's been no interest in even trying to implement. If you do that and you go down that road, it's somewhat of a colonial enterprise. We don't like that because, we're actually maintaining a supply line that's sort of a neo-colonial supply line, where you keep out cannabis from countries that are near the equator that grow cannabis quite easily. Colombia or something like that is not able to enter our markets and compete with cannabis that's grown in New Jersey, for example. And I don't know, it's just very upsetting to us that we don't see this, sort of integration. But maybe that's the point, and we're hoping that we're hoping that we're wrong, and that's not the point. But actually, that's the background I wanted you to get for that. So I'll read the question. Based on your experience with the Controlled Substances Act from both inside and outside government, what insights can you share on creating a cooperative federal-state framework that preserves patient access to state medical cannabis programs under Schedule III, rather than forcing cannabis into a traditional pharmaceutical model or allowing medical cannabis programs to be absorbed into adult use markets?
It's a very sophisticated question, Michael, and you and your colleagues, clearly have thought a lot about how to ask keen questions. And the short answer that I would have to give is I do not know. It's as you make your observations about FDA and their role on compounding pharmacy and the obstacles that you see. My experience sort of dealing with the DEA from the perspective of congressional oversight and subsequently, with sort of knowing something about how they operated from the criminal defense perspective, I would have said there would be your biggest obstacle, even if, let's say, there is some administrator who is beholden to President Trump who would want to see a cooperative federal-state relationship. You've got in DEA field offices and district offices around the country, special agents in charge who have for 30 years seen marijuana as a major problem and responsibility and cannot stomach the idea that it be legalized. And they when the distrust about cannabis and cannabis activists is deep and profound. In Maryland in 2013, when our General Assembly was writing our legislation to create a medical cannabis program in Maryland, it was so clear that the legislation is written with a distrust of any doctor who would be supposedly qualified, who would appeal for this. The regulations were enormous. And anybody who would go into this business, well, of course, they're probably criminals. The state is giving a license to Marylanders to commit federal felonies. Who lines up for that? But people inclined to commit felonies. What legitimate businessman goes to their lawyer and says, hey, I want to get a state license to commit felonies. What do you think? And what lawyer says, hey, no problem, let's do it. So it's the distrust is very, very deep and among a number of agencies. What I think I would say, and in part this is an idea that flowed from your comments about the questions of the treaties and the papers that the Veterans Action Council has published regarding the opportunity that the single convention offers for a regulated market as an option. What I think is in some sense missing is that is not yet part of a mainstream legal analysis or legal discourse around the treaty. That what you need to have are law professors writing law review articles for publication in American law reviews who are looking at the treaty and looking at the interpretation and are interpreting it the way you guys are. What you want are lawyers bringing lawsuits in federal court either to strike down some federal regulation, arguing that it's inconsistent with the treaty power. You want criminal defense lawyers raising the treaty as a defense for someone who is, being prosecuted by the feds because who's arguably in some way not compliant with the state provision, inserting sort of the treaty as a defense. That you want to begin to get federal judges thinking about this. The broader, and that then begins to spill over so that, legal commentators are talking about it. Right now, it's not yet enough of an accepted theory of interpreting the single convention that has any weight. I mean, it's well thought out. The text is there, but you do not yet have, it's like, and I'll give you an analogy. The question of what does the Second Amendment mean and why was it enacted? It was a very, very long campaign to create an interpretation that was widely accepted about the Second Amendment being about personal defense, which becomes the basis of the Supreme Court's ruling, striking down gun control laws. The counter history is that the Second Amendment was about militia, and the concern was that the power of Congress to call out the militia in Article 1 was feared by Southern states that abolitionists would summon Southern militias out of the states, setting the stage for slave rebellions. That the Second Amendment was put in as a way to give to the states the ability to prevent slave rebellion. That's what the role of the militia was. It's envisioned in the Second Amendment, and that was the driver, for James Madison from Virginia and others, to insist on a Second Amendment. That's a different kind of reading than the one that is, been established through a lot of very careful work to sort of present a way in which, these provisions of law are understood commonly. And so creating a cooperative federal state framework really ultimately is, I think, descheduling cannabis so that it's not DEA's responsibility. Maybe there's a taxation element with the Taxation and Trade Bureau, and it's the Treasury Department, and and basic regulation is operating at the states, and you're not having federal licensure and detailed engagement of the kind that surrounds controlled substances or other pharmaceutical products. And then that's obviously, what is the role for FDA in that? So you'll have then potentially a recreational industry that will be challenging a pharmaceutical industry for market. And there will be, what does the pharmaceutical industry, the cannabis pharmaceutical industry end up looking like? How does it differentiate itself? what are its products? How does it better meet patient needs? Those, I think, are some of the things that end up sort of being in the outcome of a cooperative relationship, federal and state.
Michael, do you have a follow-up or?
Yeah, I really appreciate your input. I will mention that you had said in an email you'd sent through a interview with Martin Yelsma from Transnational Institute, runs the Law and Democracy section, Drugs and Democracy section of Transnational Institute. And that's actually a really great idea. I don't think we've ever had a roundtable with Martin particularly. We've had a couple of international roundtables, but we've never had Martin. Interestingly, and you wouldn't know this, so I want to share, we did actually have a meeting with him over in Vienna. And first, there is a certain amount of consensus already on what the treaty actually should be doing right now. And that's around what the International Narcotics Control Board has said. If there is a country that wants to have CBD uncontrolled, and they think that with a teleological interpretation of the treaty that is not a problem to have CBD uncontrolled, but with a little bit of THC in it is actually a problem. And to remove that from control, they recommend using the industrial exemption of the treaty. Exactly the treaties that our friend Kenzie put forward. So we asked Martin, what was it? Because there was such a visceral reaction to that paper. The paper essentially, it's called High Compliance: How to Legalize Cannabis in Compliance with the Drug Control Treaties, and it received such a negative backlash. We were really wondering, where did that come from? And Martin said that it was just too far. It went too far. If you did say all cannabis could be exempted under that industrial exemption, that you could just openly sell adult rec cannabis and have that be under that would cause backlash. It would be, you're crazy to do that. And I thought that was so funny because the Transnational Institute has been pushing for quite a while this idea of interstate treaty modification, which they will say that it's a way to create a dialogue at the international level towards reform. But in the real sense, it would be rebellion for a country to actually do that, a handful of countries to do that, actually create a sub sort of wet and dry county at the international level, a legal zone for drugs. We thought, oh my God, you're crazy. That would create such a backlash. I thought that's funny. We both think the other's idea is crazy, would create such a backlash. So we're I guess we're cutting edge if you have that experience. But the bottom line is that. And I think this is worth mentioning. Our movement, our work has already moved on from that. We don't think it's really even a viable. We don't spend much energy on it. It's fascinating, endlessly fascinating in some regards, but we're more interested in what comes next, which is removing cannabis from the drug control treaties completely, removing all pillar drugs from the drug control treaty, and having the treaty be based on some other, some other regimen that actually is more fit to purpose. I think that the cannabis movement, along with drug policy reform movement, is ready, if asked, and certainly if invited, to actually work on making the treaty more fit to purpose, to protect the public from what's created in the laboratory. That's sort of the intent of the drug control treaty. And I think we can all agree to that if we remove, the cannabis, poppy, and coca from the battlefield. And we're looking at, under medical, sort of restoring some of the balance that was lost in 100 years of colonial cannabis prohibition, with a bunch of treaties on genetics and sharing resources and contracts and stuff like that over intellectual property, all conducted not in Vienna, where the drug control treaty is, but actually in Geneva, where it's called the World Intellectual Property Organization, with treaties with names like the Nagoya Protocol, the Convention on Biological Diversity, etc. So that's where our head's at. The legalization of.
No, let me just contribute something on this,
It's
Mike, which is,
interesting, but we're not really working on it.
so to the extent that there are those of you who would like to see the international treaties amended, recognizing that requires the cooperation of something like 180. There are 180 or 190 state signatories to the treaty. So, it's perhaps the most subscribed of all international treaties, the last time I checked. One of the things that I advocated for when I was on the board of SSDP was to expand our SSDP chapters internationally, that SSDP chapter student groups in many different countries are necessary to begin to change the views of governments that are conservative on drug policy in order to set the stage for them to vote in favor of the kinds of amendments you want. It's not going to be changed by a handful of countries which might, have gone along with President Santos in Colombia, or harm reductionists in the Netherlands, or Italy. You're going to need a much, much broader global effort. And therefore, who is in any position to begin to organize that? But a group like SSDP International. And I know that they do work, in Geneva. I haven't been in touch with the folks lately, but to the extent that American groups see amendment of the treaty as a strategic objective, it's a very important tactic, I believe, is to be providing resources, support, speakers, encouragement, scholarships to SSDP international participants to build chapters and to build a presence in countries that might be key in that international debate.
All right, next up will be Council Member Michael Davis. Mike D, you're up.
Yes. Yes. Hey, thanks for joining us tonight, Eric. Hang on, my question just disappeared, so I got to get it back real quick. Okay, so as co-founder of Families Against Mandatory Minimums and a longtime advocate against mandatory minimums, what lessons should policymakers remember as new drug reforms are being considered today?
Good question, because the lessons in many respects have not been well learned. Many well-meaning liberal policy reformers in legislatures are not aware. And the key, I would say, is that before you start trying to write laws on the criminal side with almost always, penalties, more penalties, longer penalties, new offenses with long penalties, you must understand what the drug marketplace is like that's confronting your community. That the most drug legislation is based on a kind of cartoonish view of who the dealers are, who the pushers are, what constitutes a bad guy or a kingpin. This happens to be an issue in my home state of Maryland, where in the last two sessions of the General Assembly, a General Assembly completely dominated by liberal Democrats, very well-meaning delegate of mine and my very liberal state senator, both supported a bill to create long penalties for what they call drug-induced homicide, specifically fentanyl and heroin. That if someone dies from having ingested heroin or fentanyl, the government can go after somebody who was connected in the distribution, any such person, and impose a sentence of up to 20 years. Now, we already have mandatory minimums for certain quantities. We have a kingpin provision, and you try to understand who you're going to be prosecuting. it's going to be the girlfriend of the dead man who got the drug, for the two of them. He died. She just went to the hospital. You're not going to have, if the district attorney really wants to go after the high-level trafficker, he's already got the laws to do that. If he's got the evidence of who the high-level trafficker is, he does not need to go threaten the girlfriend with 20 years. You could, if you need to pressure, somebody, you just use the trafficking statute already on the books, so that the consequence of these things is ultimately injustice, that people of low levels of culpability, low levels of criminality, who are tragically involved in these distributions are going to be the ones who will suffer the inordinately long sentences. That's been overwhelmingly the case at the federal level. The U.S. Sentencing Commission did amazing studies in the 2011, 2009 of who was getting sentenced for trafficking cocaine in federal court. The mandatory minimums of 1986 were as little as 5 grams of crack would get you a minimum of 5 years in prison, up to 40 years in prison, no parole. Parole had been abolished. And if it was 50 grams of crack, which is the weight of a candy bar, that could get you a minimum of 10 years up to life imprisonment. And you would find in New Hampshire, for example, in the year that the Sentencing Commission studied, the average weight of all the federal crack cocaine prosecutions was 3 grams. The average weight. How does any of those cases merit being in the federal court? I would argue that, the federal court should be for the most serious offenders. The federal prison has, capacity for, 180,000, 200,000 people when it's overcrowded. The states have the capacity to hold another 2 million people. The biggest drug dealer in the city of Baltimore, the biggest drug dealer in Charlottesville, the biggest drug dealer in Sacramento, the state of California, the Commonwealth of Virginia, they can prosecute these people. They have all the resources they need to lock up the biggest drug dealer on the block. You don't need DEA to come in, break down the door, and have an assistant U.S. attorney who went to Harvard and then Yale Law School, who was, third in his class, who's ambitious, and he was sort of trying a case against a public defender who went to the State University Law School. It's preposterous. There should be nobody so low financially that they need a public defender to represent them in a drug case in federal court. The Fed should be going after, if there is any role for federal drug enforcement, it should be upon the international cartel organizers that are subverting governments, that are, responsible for tons of drugs coming into the country, the murder of thousands, and the corruption, of governments. Those are the appropriate targets of federal drug enforcement, not the biggest drug dealer on the West Side. But so you've got, in most of the country, there should be no federal drug cases. Maybe you have federal drug cases in Chicago, New York, Miami, Houston, Los Angeles, New Orleans, but Concord, New Hampshire, Bangor, Maine, Beckley, West Virginia. These are not places where federal judges should be spending any time on the biggest drug dealer in the county. So the lessons then are to understand the drug market and understand what are the limited resources if you're thinking from the enforcement perspective, if you're thinking about sentencing. And the final point then, of course, is simple quantity. When simple quantity tells you really nothing about the role of the person in the offense. The guy who is the driver of the boat that has 6 metric tons of cocaine, it doesn't own the cocaine. The driver of the boat does not know what bank accounts the profits are going into, and certainly has no control over the profits. That's not your target. He may have custody for a day of hundreds of millions of dollars of cocaine, and he may be put to death after the delivery because he knows too much, but he certainly is not the kingpin. And the way in which quantities have become lazy, dishonest substitutes for identifying culpability in the drug trade is just been an unjust disaster.
Unjust disaster is a great summation. All right, I have your next question. Please tell us the history of the Criminal Justice Policy Foundation and how your guidance helped shape or even create such organizations as Students for Sensible Drug Policy and the Marijuana Policy Project, both who we work with at the United Nations.
So I've already, of course, sort of shared with you what my own views were, how they evolved. And so it had started, sort of my first hearing on drug enforcement was 1980. And by 1987, I've been involved every Congress in the enactment of one kind of drug law or another, including the incredible mandatory minimums of 1986, money laundering laws, all kinds of things, organized crime legislation, all kinds of stuff. I had a very exciting portfolio, but every 2 years, Congress would kind of come back, and it's like Groundhog Day. What are we gonna do about the war on drugs? What are we gonna do about this? There's a certain sense in which it's not terribly new, and I had, as I had alluded earlier, I'd been involved in getting arrested in the Pentagon in 1969 when I was 19 years old. I'd worked for organizations in the peace movement. I had worked in in other kinds of advocacy contexts when I was in college. Set up organizations in college, set up organizations in law school. I'd worked with Normal beginning in 1976. I knew how to write press releases. From my work on Capitol Hill, I knew what is a speech. I knew how Congress worked. I knew how to lobby. I knew how to run a meeting. I felt that I had I knew something about dope. I knew something about getting stoned. I knew something about tripping. I felt that I had a passion to try to work in this space. And so I was trying to figure out, how much longer do I want to keep working for the Congress? What would I rather do? And I spent a long weekend, sort of in a kind of workshop of sort of, for many people it was like, well, how do I, refine my resume, but it's really more, how do I, instead of applying for a job, how do I figure out what I want my life to look like? Where do I want to live? What do I want to do? Do I want to have kids? What's going to meet my needs and fulfill me? What kind of, what's my mission from God? And it was, let's figure out how to legalize drugs. And so at that time, the Drug Policy Foundation, Arnold Trebek and Kevin Zeese had started this organization, a very important organization, to begin what they called the loyal opposition in the war on drugs. And while I was working on the Hill, I'd gotten to know Arnold. I'd gone to meetings that he had organized, and I said, I know you're really busy. You're teaching. I know how to write op-eds. I write op-eds for my boss. I'll ghost write op-eds for you. So there was an op-ed in the Washington Post that the Customs Commissioner had written, William von Raab. And I thought, Arnold should write a reply to this. So I immediately wrote it up. And in those days, before faxes, before email, I put it in the mail and I mailed it to Arnold to his office. Doesn't call me up, no, doesn't call me, phone, no call. So I finally called him after like a week. I said, Arnold, what did you think about my op-ed? So I haven't had a chance to look at it yet. Well, look, when you're in the press, things get stale fast. If custom commissioner's thing is on Monday, the Post will print a reply on Friday. But 2 weeks later, it's like, who remembers what the customs commissioner said? It's stale. It's over. You've got to move. So it was clear. It was instantly clear. There's no point for me trying to sort of think I can do this with Arnold as smart and hardworking and everything, honorable he was. And so it was like, well, what can I do? So Arnold's, and so about this time, one of the things I'd done was I had, with Arnold's encouragement, I had taught a course in organized crime at American University. And I had been involved in writing legislation to create the President's Commission on Organized Crime and give it, subpoena power and a variety of things. And so I knew a little bit about organized crime. And some people came to me saying, we're representing a client who are interested in fighting organized crime. We heard you know something about it. And I gave them, my typical brain dump. And I later found out they represented a foundation in Boston. And then I heard that they were interested in drug legalization. And so I tracked down, their attorney, and I wrote a 5-page proposal. I'd never written a proposal before. I didn't know what should or should not be in it, and said, here's my idea how we could set up an organization to legalize drugs, and here's a 5-line budget, and this is what it's going to cost. And they said, well, we're interested. And we met and we talked and we back and forth. And so by Labor Day, essentially, we had a handshake that they would finance me for 3 years. I would commit to work for them for 3 years, creating this thing that became the Criminal Justice Policy Foundation. And they funded me for 32 years on the basis of that handshake. And, so that's how it got started. I had originally envisioned it, as, it's a crime fighting organization that, and you're going to fight crime a hell of a lot more effectively if drugs are legalized and cops aren't chasing drug users, and drug users don't have to commit crime to get the money to buy expensive illegal drugs, et cetera, et cetera. So from that point, then it was, what are all the opportunities? I had a budget. I could hire a press person. I could, so I had contacts. So I organized meetings. And so it was like, we started something called the National Drug Strategy Network. At one of the conferences of the Drug Policy Foundation, I arranged for, it was a presidential election year. I forget if it was 92. And I arranged for former Senator George McGovern to speak on a platform about drug legalization, along with former Congressman Pete McCluskey, both of whom ran for president. How do you talk about, drug legalization if in a presidential campaign, or, there were millions of I mean, there were, just thinking about opportunities, and one of the ideas then was the problem of mandatory minimums. How do we organize? I mean, speak the family members, the children, the spouses of people suffering these sentences. So originally it was going to be mothers opposed to mandatory sentences, moms, when those sort of, that's too cute, and we found Julie Stewart. Julie Stewart heard of us. Her brother had gone to prison for 5 years, mandatory minimum, growing a little pot in a garage in Oregon. And so, we got that started in our office. Now, SSDP, I didn't start. That was Dave Borden from Drug Reform Coordination Network and working with students. And there were students who were alarmed about the prohibition on federal student loans if you had a drug arrest. And that got them motivated. And when I heard about this, it's like, students, hell, how can I help? And after a couple of years, then one of their alumni was working for me, and I got on their board. And so I was on their board for, maybe 16 years or more. But I didn't start them, but I played a major role, early on. One of the first things we did, is financing, financing them to go to the New Hampshire primary election weekend and having these clean-cut college students go into the rooms where the candidates are taking questions from the public and having them ask questions about medical marijuana, about needle exchange, and trying to raise these issues and sort of suggest that all around the state, young people are asking about medical marijuana. And what do you think about it, Senator? What do you think about it, Governor? And I mean, I was in the position where I could sort of, pay for a bunch of hotel rooms and, half a truckload of pizza. So on MPP, Rob Campia and Chuck Thomas were students at Penn State University. Rob Campia had been a student. He had either sold or grew marijuana. I forget exactly what, but he got busted and he got convicted and he went to prison for a while. And, God damn it, but Rob Campia was going to, he wasn't taking that lying down. And he ran for student government president at Penn State, won on a marijuana legalization platform, got more votes than any other candidate in the history of student government elections at Penn State. And, organized conferences. I went up there with like Rufus King and other people to speak about, drug policy reform. And so right out of college, he and Chuck, came down to Washington, got jobs with Normal. And, and Rob, quickly understood, why are we in Washington? We're here to lobby. Why are we? We're here to change the laws. And at that time, Dick Cowan was the executive director, a good guy, a conservative, someone who knew William F. Buckley and others, sort of libertarian interest. And Rob was a libertarian, but he was so cynical. He didn't think there was any value in going up to Capitol Hill. And there became then this split. It's like, if we're not going to Capitol Hill, why the fuck are we here? And I had been organizing roundtables on criminal justice policy reform, on dealing with legislation, and going to different kinds of coalition meetings. And so I started bringing Rob along, and Rob was learning about how Capitol Hill functioned. And at some point, it was like, the tension in the office was either you can't fire me, I quit, or you're fired. But he and Chuck and there was Mike Kushner and a third, Allison Green, sort of left Normal. And it's like, well, okay, we want to start an organization. And Rob came to me and said, what do you think? I said, well, how do we, what's in? I said, well, what about Marijuana Policy Project? It's neutral sounding. It sounds authoritative. So he picked that name. And then, I was one of the 3 board members for the first 13 years, but Rob, Rob drove it, I mean, I had very little to do other than to be signing on paperwork and helping him out, early on. Rob Campia deserves enormous credit for the legalization of cannabis in the state that we're in now for driving this, and people that he hired like Karen O'Keefe, who just knew, helped write so many of the state laws on cannabis. So the the creation is what, often I wasn't necessarily present at the creation of those entities, but I was able to contribute, a variety of ideas or connections or just even support and encouragement, to the right people at the right time. Um, so that's question 6. Thank you. Good
Thank
question.
you. Next up will be Nate Landau with question number 7. Nate.
Okay. My question is, what was there a big learning curve uh, to working in the NGO world after leaving the government? Thank you.
That's a good question. I didn't find that there was a big learning curve in some sense. I could have probably been a smarter manager. I think the challenge was really, I mean, I was a lawyer, I was a legislative analyst, I could give a speech, I could write speeches, I could answer questions, I could teach. I think that the biggest, in retrospect, if I had been a more disciplined manager, a more thoughtful manager, I would have been more more effective. One thing that I was able to, and so, I mean, I one major thing that I did not have to do that almost everybody in the NGO world struggles with is staying funded, raising funds and staying funded. I was blessed by a steady stream of support from the Linnell Foundation. The Bob Linnell and his estate, his family, his professional colleagues, um, were made sure that I had enough money. And I did not then have to organize campaigns on the basis of how do you raise funds. And so in some sense, it's very, very different than for almost every other NGO that must figure out, how do I pay the bills? Who's going to pay me to do this? There's no profit, there's no product, there's no profit. How do one of the geniuses that Rob brought in his success was he kept coming up with projects. Here's a campaign. He had a concrete campaign that he could sell. And I did not have that challenge. And so, in some sense, I was not as successful because I was not focused on saying I've got to sell what an outcome to a particular funder so that I can continue to get funded. It was, Rob had a different, another kind of thing is Rob recognized I need to build a dues paying membership, that I cannot only rely on a handful of funders. I mean, I was incredibly lucky. I had a handshake with some guys who continued to fund me. They could have at any point said, Eric, we've changed our mind. Thanks very much. And that would have turned off the lights. Boom. So, it was a very unusual. My experience is not easily replicated, or um, the things that I learned from others. Julie Stewart from FAM, the need to cultivate people who believe in your project, who can fund you. Finding people who can fund you is that's that would have been for me a huge learning curve. Um, Um, so I'll
All
leave it
right.
there.
No. That's a reality. I mean, that's one of the reasons why we're a working group and not a nonprofit, because we didn't want to spend our time, chasing money if you're not able to find founders or if people who can, benefact you and really push you along. I mean, we used our profits from BPG to fund Americans for Safe Access, right? To literally pay the rent, pay the staffers, pay the electricity, all that stuff that are real needs, and they come every single month, and that's a reality and a challenge. And to find a benefactor that believes in you is something that is a real challenge, especially out there to nonprofits. And speaking of somebody who understands that very well, Marilyn Mathery, who also does Patients at a Time on the side and knows that, name doesn't necessarily always equate to, the financial realities or people that they think there's a lot of money in what we do. That's necessarily working for social justice and making change. That's not necessarily a reality many of us face. So with that, Marilyn Mathery.
Yeah, you kind of touched on this anyway, Eric, so it might be a little easy question here. How'd you learn to manage a nonprofit, and to what do you credit the outsized impact of your organization?
So I think that, I mean, in one sense, I spoke a little bit about the management. I think that I was lucky that in one sense, because I had to spend so little time thinking about fundraising, and not a whole lot of time did I have to then spend responding to my funders, but except sort of, giving them updates and reports, and that they were satisfied. I was able to spend essentially all my time trying to figure out what are projects. And so, so how can I identify what I think is newsworthy? What is, who are people who have a vision? I sometimes thought of myself as a kind of movement architect. What what organizations are needed to accomplish the work of this movement? So, you know, promptly, and families against mandatory minimums. Okay, families of the victims of the war on drugs. In that sense. Um, David Borden, starts SSDP, and it's like students are a very powerful force. I want to work with them. Um, Chuck Thomas was active with the Unitarian Universalist Church, and he started a group called the Interfaith Drug Policy Initiative. The Interfaith Drug Policy Initiative. He had someone who's active with the Reform Women in Judaism, and I'm active as a Quaker, and so here's a thing that we need. Um, there were there Tom Haynes in New York recognized the role of lawyers and started a group called the Voluntary Committee of Lawyers. And I was active with the American Bar Association, and was, how do we who are people we can try to mobilize to speak for a kind of constituency. Um, I, for many years, tried to organize business people. I created something that never got to be more than a website called the Business Council for, uh, let's see, Prosperity and Safety, the Business Council for Prosperity and Safety. And the idea was that the war on drugs hurts the economy. You've got, you've got, whether or not it's the increased costs to insurance premiums from the crime from drugs, the fact that people with convictions can't work and earn their full potential. They're not, able to qualify for a home mortgage, buy a home, get a car loan. Look at all the, millions of people in our society who are hurt by the war on drugs, who can't participate in the economy, and therefore profits are down. S&P 500 is lower than it otherwise would be. Corporate profits are down, investors are earning less money, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I couldn't find somebody who would finance taking on that particular idea. The other one that, I was unable to sell people on was drug treatment professionals for legalization. I mean, if you spend your life in drug treatment, you understand thoroughly that the war on drugs is hurting the people you care about. It's not, sending people to prison because they have a substance use disorder does nothing to help them. Making them homeless, kicking them out of their school, kicking them off their job. None of that helps people suffering, and so, this would have struck me again as a kind of a natural constituency to organize. It would have an enormous amount of credibility. So, I mean, part of what I was able to do is I could respond quickly to things that I heard about. Barry McCaffrey, Bill Clinton's drug czar, he's going to have a drug policy summit at a hotel in Washington. Okay, all right, I can organize an event on the park outside the hotel. I can find somebody, we can get a statement written that'll be slipped into the delegates' materials inside the hotel. I can organize a press conference condemning the summit, or, I mean, so it was in part unlike Rob, where I was locked into, I had a whole bunch of campaigns that I needed to do to satisfy my funders. I could come up with a campaign on a couple of days and switch gears in some sense quickly to respond. So I mean, those were, obviously my funders, if I did not have the steady, dependable funders that I had, I could not have accomplished what I did, and I am grateful for them every day.
All right, Michael Crowitz with our next question. Michael.
Thank you, Etienne. Before I ask my question, I just want to thank you, Eric. Over the years, I was just trying to think, I remember coming to you many, many times over the years asking for your help. I don't remember you ever saying no. I don't remember really asking for a lot of money or anything, but I remember asking almost impossible things that I was trying to do or try to figure out. And I really appreciate your help. Was, obviously I was successful in the things that I was doing, and I know that you helped me at a pivotal point, and that's about all I can tell you without it being classified. No, just kidding. But yeah. So anyway, the question, switching gears here a little bit. It's interesting to me because we have always over the years talked about policy, sort of in general terms, esoteric terms, even talk about harm reduction and different applications of policy for better outcomes, and some of the atrocities of the war on drugs, certainly individual cases, but never really focused from a drug perspective. So this question is coming from a particular perspective, looking at psychedelics. You helped create the Maryland Commission that studied psilocybin legalization. What convinced you that psychedelics deserve serious policy consideration, and what did the task force ultimately find?
Well, Michael, just to sort of say that one blessing that I had, since I did have a stream of funding, is that people could come to me and ask me for help and know that I was not a rival for their funding. They didn't have to worry that I was going to compete with them for the funds that they were trying to have, and that because I did not have to focus on, because I didn't have to constantly be thinking about fundraising as the executive director, I was in a position where I could respond to people like, you or, many, many people who would call me up, out of the blue, seeking advice on, some aspect of, I remember Richard Lee, who started Oaksterdam, Richard reminded me of one time when, he'd called a bunch of people and they wouldn't give him the time of day. And he called me up, and I just, took his call and we talked and talked. I forget, I don't remember what I said, but he remembered the encouragement and the advice, and he went on and, founded Oaksterdam. I mean, it is an enormously important West Coast institution for cannabis reform. So in thinking about psilocybin legalization, or psychedelics, I mean, so um, I was incredibly lucky in my experiment with street drugs, in my early 20s when when somebody, somebody would give me a capsule of something and say it was LSD. Fortunately, that's mostly what it was. Um, I uh, I found that the circumstances and where however I was led, the 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 psychedelic drugs that I used helped put me in closer and closer connection to the divine until I had an experience in in Denali, in Alaska, and I was on a cliff looking down, out at this huge valley outside the national park, and God came to me and commanded me to acknowledge him as the ruler of the universe. And, as I reflected later, how can something like this be delegitimized because it's illegal? How can something as profound as this be trivialized because it's against the law? I mean, the experience was real powerful and genuine. And so I had, when I use cannabis, one of the things that just so often, almost always happens is there's a moment when become much more deeply aware of the creation, of the createdness of the world. Um, Cannabis is a entheogen for me. And so these, these I know, so I knew about the power of these and the value of these different compounds. Um, I had this amazing situation where, I started the Criminal Justice Policy Foundation in 1989, and in 1990, the Supreme Court undermined American free exercise of religion in a case called Employment Division of Oregon versus Smith, in which a man named Smith, Albert Smith, who was a member of the Native American Church of North America, was fired from the job as a drug treatment counselor in Oregon because he used peyote, the sacrament of his church. And he goes to the employment division and seeks unemployment compensation, and the unemployment compensation bureaucrats say, no, you don't get it. This is misconduct. You violated the criminal law. And it's like, wait a minute, this is the sacrament of my church. I'm a Native American. This is, there's, and so, he appeals this decision, and the various appellate courts in Oregon say, you're right. You have a free exercise of religion here. You're not fired for cause. You're entitled to get unemployment benefits. Well, the Attorney General of Oregon, who wanted to be governor, wanted to be a drug warrior, and he takes the case to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court says, the majority says, oh, well, this is drugs. This is drugs. We're gonna throw out all of our precedents regarding the free exercise of religion. Um, and if it's an ordinary criminal law, you don't have any kind of free exercise religion right to violate an ordinary criminal law. And they just didn't look any deeper. Well, all of organized religion responded to the implications of this and formed something called the Coalition for Free Exercise of Religion. And they pushed in 1993 for the enactment of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which many of us have heard of over the years. The Native American, it happened that in so as I had mentioned, I don't know if I'd mentioned that I had become a Quaker when I was in college, and the Quakers actually invented lobbying in Britain in the 17th century. Quakers, did not take oaths. Quakers did not take their hat off in front of the king or other royalty. They did not belong to the established Church of England. And thousands of Quakers were arrested. William Penn, as a Quaker, because he did not take oaths, could not practice law, even though he had studied at the Inns of Court. William Penn, in fact, was jailed for preaching outside a padlocked Quaker meeting house in London and held in the Tower of London. And of course, then Penn later is able to start Pennsylvania. He goes to the Delaware Valley and goes to the Indians and purchases the right to start, the city of Philadelphia and this place, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And the Quakers have always thought of themselves as having a respectful relationship with the Indians. And so there's still an active Quaker outreach to Indians. And there was a man who was doing that outreach who was an anthropologist who had studied in Mexico the Huichol, who use peyote in the traditional way that has been used since before the Spanish Inquisition, since before the Spanish conquest. Jay Fikes is his name, and Jay was friends with many of the leaders of the Native American Church of North America that used peyote. About 250,000 Native Americans use peyote in their worship. And so nobody was paying any attention to the fact that this free exercise of religion case was a peyote case. And so the Indians and the Quakers got together, and like the day before the meeting, somebody who worked at the Friends Committee on National Legislation remembered Eric Sterling knows something about drugs, and he's a Quaker. And I got called in at the last minute to come to this meeting on Capitol Hill at the offices of the Friends Committee on National Legislation. And we're kind of discussing, here's this, this drug here's this holy medicine that we use. It gives us visions. It connects us with the divine. We use it, under these specialized kinds of circumstances at a sacred fireplace and so forth and so on. And I'm sitting there knowing I know nothing about this. I mean, I had friends who peddled peyote buttons, from a school bus or something in California, but I didn't know anything about this church. And I laid out a legislative campaign for the Native American Church of North America, that we would start a Native American Religious Freedom Project. We would host it in my office. We'd have a press conference. We'd have an event on Capitol Hill. We'd find an opportunity to sort of worship with peyote somewhere inside the Beltway, because there aren't any teepees, there aren't any signs that sort of say Native American worship here on Saturday night. Bring your own peyote. You want to go to a mosque, you want to go to a synagogue, you want to go to any kind of temple, they're all open. You can find them. They're there. They're all over. A sacred fireplace around a teepee. The teepee's put up, taken down. That's it. Nobody knows it happened. So I arranged for this to take place in Greenbelt, Maryland. We had these events. I developed this interest, and I became aware then later of the Council on Spiritual Practices in California. So I was approached by someone who was interested in psychedelic policy in Annapolis and said, "We want you to be involved in this." I said, "Sure, how can I?" And so a meeting was called, and I said, "Okay, so what are we going to, this is a meeting with legislators to lay out this idea. What are we going to hand them? What's going to be in their hands when they leave?" And I said, "Well, that's a good question." somebody's had some idea of something that they passed out in New York. I said, you can't pass out a New York thing here in Annapolis, Maryland. It's got to be an Annapolis thing. So I completely rewrote it and essentially laid out what would be a plan for legalizing psilocybin in Maryland, or psychedelics, natural psychedelics. And legislators took the plan, got enacted. It passed our state unanimously. The governor signed the bill, created a commission. The governor appointed me as a member of the commission. And the commission, after a lot of study, then recommended that psilocybin be legalized for medical and therapeutic purposes, for responsible adult spiritual purposes, and how this might be done, on some kind of basis. So that report was published last October, and we're waiting. We're sort of anticipating that after the elections in Maryland, when everybody in Maryland is up for election or re-election, after the election, we will begin to become more engaged in talking about these recommendations and developing legislation to implement it and so forth.
All right. Well, thank you for that. Next up will be Mike Davis.
Okay. Yeah, this is all fascinating. You were mentioning Quakers and everything, and I just I'm from the Midwest, and I was thinking like Pennsylvania area. Yeah, so yeah, just fascinating. My next question is, having traveled throughout the United States, South America, and Europe studying drug policy firsthand, what international models have impressed you the most? Real quick before you answer that, this is kind of an interesting question because just the other day, Michael and I were discussing kind of like, pharmacy-based models and how different countries prescribe their cannabis, like Italy and Malta and Uruguay and Germany. I was kind of researching, the different pharmacy-based model prescription models. Some do the compounding pharmacy models, like Michael was talking about earlier, and the different prescribing models, and was thinking about kind of putting together like a white paper because with Schedule 3, I'm not quite sure how all that stuff's going to kind of come to fruition later. So, but yeah, really interested. This is all really great information. Thank you.
The short answer to the question is that my travels and experience are now, on the order of 30 years out of date. I don't know enough about what has evolved to give a useful answer to that question. It's an important question. I don't know enough to be able to answer it intelligently.
All right.
Well, fair enough. That's good.
No, that's honest. I mean, that's I brought you here for your perspective, so that's important. All right, I'll move on to our next question. You served as principal author of Maryland's medical cannabis regulations. What aspect of Maryland's approach do you believe other states should emulate? And what do you think that people should avoid?
The main thing that I would say is to talk about avoiding. I don't know that our particular system is much better than that of another state. But what I did learn was that we really conceptually screwed up the licensing at the beginning. We envisioned that we wanted to only give licenses to the best, most qualified applicants for those licenses, those who could best run a dispensary, who could best be a grower. And that we had, because of the requirements of our law, we wrote very complicated, specific regulations that the licensees would have to comply with. from security and disposal and hiring and blah, 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 a whole lot of things that they sort of had to do. And in order then to find the best applicants, we um, we hired a contractor to carry out an evaluation of the application process, of the applicants that are submitted. And we wrote, so the first thing, so the mistake number one was conceiving that we wanted the best. Instead of thinking about saying, a deeper goal is that there is justice and broad opportunity to participate in this market. That there'd been a lot of talk about the social equity, but we hadn't figured out exactly how to do that piece of it. My advice is that you have a lottery in which you get people who sort of at some level maybe can express an interest in getting a state license to commit a felony, and you hold, some minimum requirement in terms of like maybe just an application fee, and everybody who wants to get a license, you make sure everybody knows about it, and you have a lottery. And if you have 10,000 people apply, and you're a state that's 30% Black, and maybe 20% of your applicants are Black, it's likely, if your lottery has worked effectively, 20% of your people who've won the lottery are going to be Black, or the other, whatever the minorities are that you want to make sure are adequately represented in your license application. Then all that they need to do is to meet the minimum standard that you set. They don't have to be the best. They don't have to complete a 100-page questionnaire about how they would do this. You just have to sort of be satisfied that they understand enough what their responsibilities are, and that they say, we're going to carry out these responsibilities. We're going to, find a place, and it's going to be secure, and we're going to hire the people who need to sort of do it, and we're going to do what we need to sort of test it, and we're going to do what we need to put these labels on it, and so we'll do what we need to do to follow the regulations you've imposed. And if they can get the financing, and if they can, they get a license to open up the business, and then they either survive or fail in the marketplace. But at least you started then with an equity where you don't end up with the wealthiest, most connected people at the front end getting all the licenses, which is what happened, which led to litigation that slowed the whole thing down and gave the whole thing a terrible name for 3 or 4 years. So that's my only piece of advice about what to avoid and how to avoid it.
No, wise words, and one through lived experience, which is, again, the most important, and that filter through the top in the end. All right, Council Member Nate Landau with our next question. Are you there, Nate? Yeah, we may have some technical difficulties there. After Nate was Mary Lynn. So Mary Lynn, you want to take the next question? There.
Okie doke. Let me find it again. Sorry. All righty. For younger advocates entering cannabis, psychedelic, and criminal justice reform today, what opportunities do you see, and what mistakes should they avoid repeating?
I think that for people who see themselves as advocates, there are enormous opportunities, because these are still, in the case of psychedelics, the whole way in which the culture is going to ultimately use these materials is still undefined. How will we provide safe access? How do we convince fearful legislators who don't want to make a mistake you've got a plan that's going to work? So one challenge is to develop plans that will work. The I think, in terms of cannabis, again, there are still, I mean, I guess the question is whether, in terms of the distinction between sort of people who are interested in the advocacy versus people interested in the business. It was from the 1970s up until, 10 years ago, cannabis was a universe involving advocates for reform. Now the advocates are primarily the paid lobbyists of the interests that are growing, processing, distributing cannabis in various states, or those desiring to do it or expand it. And so the nature of advocacy has certainly changed in the cannabis space, unfortunately. It is very hard, the challenge to represent a more genuine consumer perspective as opposed to the business perspective, to represent the patient perspective, a doctor perspective, when so much of the money is involved in sort of the recreational side of cannabis. So there are great challenges to make sure that medical access is effective. You need to obviously, what are the what are the needs of patients, and are they being protected in terms of the different kinds of means of administration, the different kinds of dosage opportunities, questions of what is pricing, what is taxing, or the lack of tax, the limitation on taxation. Mistakes to avoid. Well, so one kind of mistake is the challenge of dealing with ego. Do I say, okay, I want to have my own organization and I don't want to be part of yours? The question of sort of, fractionalization or decentralization of the petty fights that can begin to break out within organizations. I mean, how, trying to get people to collaborate with difference. I mean, these are, of course, challenges that exist in the corporate world, and they exist in academia, and they exist in churches, and they exist in families and so forth. It's, you've got, to what extent, is there, principles of dispute resolution, how you're going to do business, who do the challenge of figuring out who am I going to work with initially? I mean, if I had, my decision not to try to work with Arnold Treback and Kevin Zeese, ended up being the right one for me. That was the luck of the draw. Thinking about, avoiding mercurial funders. Is there a funding stream? Thinking about how to fundraise. One of my lessons to students at SSDP is learn how to fundraise, become practiced as a fundraiser. Whether it's starting, in high school or college, doing car washes and selling pizzas or having bake sales, but understanding the importance of fundraising. If you can raise funds, then there's a job for you. If you can raise funds for your project, you'll be able to carry out the project. And so, one of the most important things that I encourage people is thinking of, is learning how to be a fundraiser, learning, overcoming the enormous cultural resistance of asking people to help you, asking for favors. A lesson from Washington is when you ask someone for a favor, you are giving them more power because you're in their debt. Members of Congress want to be asked for favors because when they can help you, then you're going to vote for them. You're going to put their bumper sticker on your car. You're going to go door to door for them. They helped you. You asked for help and they came and helped. If you ask people for help, you know, and they help you, you can count on, they're likely to answer your phone call, introduce you to somebody, so a mistake is do not be afraid to ask for help. Do not be afraid to ask for money. Um, I think a great challenge is the challenge of how outlandish can I go? How, I mean, you can see I'm sitting here today. I'm wearing a necktie that is neatly tied and a button-down shirt and a jacket. And my hair is trimmed. I'm clean shaven. This is very, very deliberate. You know, um, you I am talking about these things, and it was part of my presentation to be as authoritative as I could. How did how radical could I be? Well, I could be as radical as I wanted, but at least I didn't look threatening. You know, these are, and so, there's this, there is the, earlier today, I was actually wearing a tie-dye t-shirt before I got my hair cut, you know, but the, and so there's the tension, how do I maintain my authentic self, or what is my authentic self? Um, Being authentic ultimately is what carries forward. Um, Mistakes can be thinking you've got to have an answer for every question and sort of being able to say, no, I don't know the answer to that. A mistake is thinking you can bullshit your way through something. You get caught up on that. A mistake is, I figured out that the war on drugs doesn't make sense. I must be brilliant, and therefore all my ideas are brilliant. I mean, I don't know how many people I've met in drug policy reform who believe themselves to be brilliant because they figured out drug policy is absurd. Drug prohibition is absurd. Duh. That's not a very high bar, if you ask me. You may be challenging conventional wisdom, but that doesn't make you brilliant. And yet then we hear, people carry on in various ways. Um, it is and I'll conclude with this one, which is the genuine oppression that we feel by the drug prohibition regime on our lives, that we've experienced for our entire lives, is an oppression that we have to guard against becoming emotional and exaggerated in our response. That we have to be careful about, overgeneralizing so that every cop is a fascist because there are some DEA agents who are cruel or, and they are hurtful in their language, and that the consequences of what they do are so horrendous and vicious and misguided. The danger of overgeneralizing and attaching bad motives to our enemies. We talked a lot about Joe Biden, today. It was, so Joe Biden, like me, was responsible for a lot of bad drug law. You guys don't think I'm a bad guy, notwithstanding where my fingerprints are. Is Joe Biden a bad guy because we see where his fingerprints are? I don't think so. That's, and so even, you know, I mean, there are, so it is the importance of being able to have a certain humility about yourself and a humility about your judgment of people you perceive as your enemies or your obstacles or those you disagree with. So I want to close with that.
No, it's an epic close to an epic conversation. You have, you have been a guide and a sage to many as we've navigated these uncharted waters for decades, and having people to many of my friends and mentors who have relied on you over the years, and we can't thank you enough for your dedication and your selflessness. You have worked for change more so than the change that you affected, and there's very few people that we have seen that can outweigh their own accomplishments through their own achievements as you did so later in life. There's very few people that can be held on that pedestal, and you are one of those for us. So
Well,
I cannot thank you enough for your time and your dedication. And as Mike gave the tip of the hat, our eternal respect as well, for you giving our people the understanding of the lived experience and the perspective that it's given you. And somebody even wrote in the chat, it's like it feels like we're going backwards, but we have to know our history so that one, we don't repeat it. And in living this new age and this history that we're having, we've been able to continue to affect that change. And as I tell people, careful, changing history can be quite addictive. And a lot of fun along the way, because you meet amazing people along the way, like my fellow council members and people like yourself. So,
well, Ken and everybody, thank you so much for the honor of speaking to you. I mean, you asked me to reflect on what was really, my 50-year career in this. It is an honor to provide this kind of oral history and to feel, I mean, it's deeply, deeply gratifying to me, at this stage in my life to be both asked to do this and to be able to continue to contribute. It's been, it's just, I've had as much fun doing this as I think anybody could have in their work,
well,
over the years.
if people want to get hold of you, how would people get hold of you? Or do you have anything on social media or things that you do? How do they keep up to date with Eric E. Sterling?
I'm on LinkedIn. I've kept the criminal justice policy website is still available at www.cjpf.org. People send me email at eric.sterling@gmail, which is, pretty easy to remember. And so it's not too hard to find me.
Right on. Well, thank you very much for your time. I would like to thank our council members, Nate Landau, Mary Lynn Mathry, Michael Davis, Mike Crowitz, and myself, Etienne Fontan. This has been our Veterans Action Council number 103 with Eric E. Sterling, drug policy expert extraordinaire. So thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your week, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you all so much. Good night. Be safe. Be happy.